A few years ago, I made 2 videos about how living creatures seem to appear from nowhere. I recently discovered another of these situations. Last winter, I put 2 empty buckets on my patio to collect rainwater so I could see how much rain I got, and I planned to use the water for potted plants during the dry season. I assumed that since it was clean rainwater, I would not have to worry about mosquitoes breeding in the buckets. A few months later, I noticed one of the buckets was full of mosquito larvae and had lots of orange dots on the bottom. The other bucket had darker dots, but not many mosquitoes. What were the larvae eating, and where did their food come from? I captured a mosquito larva and some of the orange dots. I put them in a drop of water that was so small that it was difficult for the mosquito to move. The orange dots turned out to be rotifers with some type of orange stuff inside them. I don't have the depth of field to keep everything in focus, so I'll put the head in focus now. The drop of water was so small that the mosquito could breathe through its tail while laying on the bottom of this stainless steel container. The blurry white section is the reflection of the mosquito in the container. And here is his tail, which splits into 2 sections, one that goes to the surface for breathing and the other is the anus. I discovered that some of the larger orange dots were dead insects that either had rotifers surrounding them or inside them. I also discovered that some of the rotifers were almost transparent, and the only way I could see them clearly was to look directly down on them while shining a light from below. This particular light was not very bright, but years earlier I had soldered 24 LEDs into a bundle to make a spotlight, and so I used that to make a small light table. I put that bundle into a cardboard cylinder with a glass top that I scratched to diffuse the light. Here is a clear rotifer with normal lighting. The rods are hairs from my head to show you that rotifers are about as thick as a human hair. That white flash was when I turned the LED lights on underneath it. Some of the rotifers are even larger than this one. I printed a 1 millimeter grid on a clear sheet of plastic with a laser printer and put it on top of the LED lights. As this rotifer stretches itself out, it is reaching almost 1/2 millimeter in length. The rotifers are so large that we should be able to see them with our eyes, but most of their body parts are translucent, and the water makes them almost invisible. This rotifer looks as if it's underneath the 1 millimeter grid, but it's actually on top of it, and the light is shining from below. Many of them are larger than the stubble of my beard from my electric razor, so they should be just as easy to see. I put some of that stubble in the water so that you can see how they compare in size. It looks as if their head has 2 circular brushes that spin around in circles, but I don't have the equipment to get a good view of their heads. The internet has a lot of good quality photos of rotifers, but I have yet to find a video that clearly shows the rotating brushes. I suppose it needs a high-speed camera, and then we could slow the video down to see what's happening. I discovered that a microbiologist has produced some videos with excellent images of these rotifers and other tiny creatures. I'll put a link in the description. In addition to the mosquito larvae and rotifers, there were some tinier creatures that were too small for me to identify. Here is an empty shell of a mosquito larva, and it's full of what appear to be single-celled creatures. When I poke the shell with a large pin, some of them come out. Because the buckets were full of mosquito larvae, I dumped the water on the plants, but I did not wash the container because I wanted to see if any of the creatures that were still clinging to the bucket would come back to life after they dry out. Rotifers can come back to life after they have dehydrated, just like yeast. So I let the bucket remain dry and empty for a couple of months in my garage. Then I put some clean water into it. It quickly became full of rotifers and other tiny creatures, although there were no mosquito larvae. The algae came back to life also. Many of those single-celled oval creatures are larger than the diameter of a hair from my head. But none of them would stop moving, so it was difficult to get a good view of them. The only way I could get them to hold still was to isolate a few in such a small amount of water that they couldn't swim anywhere. But then the water quickly evaporated and they all dehydrated. How did these creatures get into the buckets of water? According to information on the internet, dehydrated rotifers and other creatures are blowing around in the dust. That means they are also occasionally falling into our food, and we must occasionally breathe them, swallow them, and get them in our eyes. That's not something to worry about, but it makes me wonder why the OCD people who are paranoid of diseases don't have any fear of dust. I wondered if the creek near my house was also full of rotifers, so I took a sample of the water, but I didn't find any rotifers. Instead, I found much larger copepods and amphipods. Since these creatures eat rotifers, I suppose they ate all of them in the tiny sample that I took from the creek. If you search the internet for images of them, you can find some high-quality photos that are much better than what I can provide. I had a difficult time getting video because they don't sit still, and they are always trying to hide under something. They also have an incredible ability to accelerate and to come to a stop quickly. There were also some bright orange worms that I have not been able to identify yet. They would create a hollow tube of algae and dirt by making the particles stick together, and then they would hide inside the tube. There were also some clam-like creatures. I have not been able to identify them yet either. These are just a few of the tiny creatures that are all around us, but we normally don't notice them. It would be nice if there were some video documentaries about them, and about what is blowing around in the dust in different cities and in different times of the year. Here is some dust that I deliberately let collect for a few years so that I could see how much accumulates and what it looks like. This dust was on an object that was sitting on the top of a bookcase inside my house, so it's full of fibers, which I suppose are from clothing, carpeting, and blankets. But the dust also has lots of little particles. I suppose a lot of them are pieces of skin, but there may also be pieces of dried saliva and mucus from when somebody coughs or sneezes, and some of the particles must be coming from the outside. And who knows what those are.